Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the annual Albert A. Smith Lecture at the Reformed Church Center. We are glad you can all be here with us. It is very appropriate, I think, that the Albert A. Smith Lecture, which exists because of a gift from First Reformed Church in Schenectady and is named after a former pastor of First Reformed Church, today is being given by a member of First Reformed Church in Schenectady, a son of First Reformed Church. Benjamin Doolittle is a minister in Schenectady Classis, a son of First Reformed in Schenectady, our Albert A. Smith Fellow this academic year, and he is an RCA minister active in a local UCC parish in New Haven, Connecticut, where he is professor of internal medicine and pediatrics at Yale University School of Medicine, program director of the combined internal medicine and pediatrics residency program at Yale, and medical director of the Yale Medicine-Pediatrics Practice. He also, I know, does some lecturing and teaching at the Yale Divinity School and talking about the relationship between medicine and spirituality. So, and was this past General Synod, for those of us who got there, advising the General Synod of 2021 on safe meeting practices during the COVID pandemic. So we are very glad to have him here, and even more appropriately, I think, well, mostly appropriately because she is the right person to have doing this talk. The person responding to Dr. Doolittle's presentation will be Janice McLean Farrell, who also has a chair named after somebody who was pastor at First Schenectady. She is the Dirk Romine Assistant Professor of Metro Urban Ministries and Assistant Dean of Doctoral Studies here at New Brunswick. She has theology degrees from the University of Edinburgh, Princeton Theological Seminary, and Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, as well as a degree in chemistry from the University of Delaware. And her areas of specialization include religion and public life, migration, and urban immigrant youth and religion. So we are glad to have Janice here. It pleases me. I've had a wonderful time getting to know him this year. It pleases me to welcome Ben Doolittle.
Hello, everybody. Good cheer, greetings. Very happy to be with you all. Thank you for coming on, because we all know it's the Zoomosphere and we all Zoom a lot. And so for you to come here and visit with me is a great joy and an honor for me. So I'm very, very happy that you all came. I can't see you. You're like, it's like I'm talking to myself. So thank you. Please raise your hand, when we have our question time, so we can have a nice visit. Let me gas up the slides here. This was the project. Have we been here before? The impact of the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic on church life. That is the question. So as James shared, I grew up in Schenectady, and First Reformed Church of Schenectady was my home church. And I taught Sunday school there as a high school kid. I was a Stevens minister. I did all the youth group. That's my home church. And Reverend Smith was my pastor. And he, when I was finishing high school and going into college, and he encouraged me to go to divinity school, to go into the ministry. And so for him, I am forever in his debt, and he will forever be this important person in my life. He died far too young, in his 50s. And when he died, his wife, Linda, gave me one of his robes, his summer preaching robe, which I use to this day. And so that's a picture of me when I started in the ministry in 1991, when I was a student at Yale Divinity School. And that's me looking fresh and young, wearing the Reverend Albert Smith's robe. And that's what I look like today. And I'm still wearing his robe. And as Providence would have it, I'm actually did a long circuitous work, and I'm back at the church I started at back in 1991. So, and as the good Reverend James shared, I wear two hats. I'm a physician who teaches and wears a few hats at the Yale Medical School, and I'm a pastor at a congregational church on the other side of the Berkshires, on the other side of the Hudson River, in Connecticut, in New Haven. So that's who I am, and so this is the outline. Now, Reverend Brum tells me I have 20 minutes, which is really just getting started. But as they teach you in preaching class, if you can't say it in 20 minutes, you can't say it in 40 minutes. But this is the outline. The influenza pandemic of 1918-1919, just a brief overview. And then what happened after that in the 1920s? How did the influenza pandemic affect life in America overall? And we'll share a little bit about the RCA. What was the interpretation of the influenza pandemic for the Reformed Church in America? And then we'll discuss some lessons learned, and we'll see if, we'll hear wisdom from our colleague, Dr. Janice, and wisdom from you all. So to get us started, time for a poll. If you go into your chat, you're going to see a link. And this is to check the temperature of the Zoom room. So if you click on that link, I invite you to answer the question, which pandemic infected the most people? COVID-19, so our pandemic, or the pandemic of 1918, 1919. And you can see there are a couple choices there if you're not sure, or you can decide about how sure that you are. Now, these are absolute numbers, so not by percentage of the population, because of course the population was a lot less back 100 years ago. And so thank you for playing along here. Our choices are COVID-19, definitely. COVID-19, I think. Well, they're about the same, maybe about the same. Well, influenza pandemic, I think, hard to say. Influenza pandemic, definitely. So we got, and thank you. So people are deciding. That middle answer, nobody's interested in the middle way. It's one or the other. We got in the chat, we got Catherine Tremarco said C. So we got one vote for about the same. Dr. McLean Farrell said E. Dean Frey said 1918, definitely. Well, folks, thanks for playing along. The gold star goes to Catherine Tremarco, actually, because the answer is it's about the same. It's about the same. And I checked this morning. So in 1918, we think that the influenza virus infected about 500 million people. And if you go, check covidometer.com or the New York Times, you'll see that it's about 500 million people, 505 million people today got infected. Now, obviously, percentage-wise, it's a lot more people back 100 years ago. So we think maybe it was about a third of the entire world population got infected. And of course, we'll never know for sure, but that's just the best guess. about 50 million to 100 million people died. So if you got infected, you had about a 10 to 20% chance of dying of the flu. So that's very, very serious. About 1 million people have died in the United States from the influenza pandemic. And that's about the same from COVID-19. So about the same. So absolute numbers between influenza, 1918, 1919, and COVID-19, about the same. Do you guys remember a couple years ago, maybe about 8-10 years ago, there was a big H1N1 strain of the influenza virus that was making its way around the country? Well, 100 years ago, it was an H1N1 virus. That's for the true virologic aficionados to just be reminded of. So it was an especially virulent strain. In America, it decreased the average lifespan by 12 years. COVID-19 has not necessarily decreased the average lifespan by much overall, but it has among people of color, actually. So back 100 years ago, 12 years decrease in lifespan because it infected or killed young people. And we think that's due to the inflammatory response, the robust inflammatory response of younger, healthier bodies that caused younger people to die. And we saw some of that happen among the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is the three peaks of the influenza pandemic. You could see it started a little bit around July of 2018. The big peak happened in that winter of 2018, 2019. And then there was a third peak that happened in the spring of 2019. So, and this was deaths per 1,000 people. So, you know, this is a lot of people dying, 0.25 almost of the entire population dying every day during this peak. And just to compare, it's not quite the same, you know, this was total deaths, but you can see the COVID pandemic, this came from a report by the CDC. So you can see that things really got cooking in March of 2020. Things cooled off in the summertime. Then we had another big peak in December 2020 that affected the winter. So very similar to the influenza pandemic. And then we're having these third and fourth peaks that happen. And this is deaths. And of course, deaths always lag behind the cases, people who get it. So it looks similar, right? Not exactly the same, but it looks similar. So, all right. So if you opened the New York Times and if you open the New York Times in 1918, 1919, what would you find in the New York Times? And of course, for those who haven't been to New Brunswick Seminary in recent months, this is the bust of Horace Underwood. He was a graduate of New Brunswick Theological Seminary in the 19th century. He was a missionary to Korea. And the reason why the Presbyterian Church is so vibrant and persists to this day is due to Horace Underwood. And I could not resist. Someone in a very cheeky way put a mask on Horace Underwood, and that's who he is, and that's why he's in the slide. So he's not contemporary to the influenza pandemic. But if you open the New York Times, during 1918, 1919, you would read something like this. This was from the front page. Grip now sweeping 43 states, drastic steps taken throughout the nation to check the epidemic. Public meetings are stopped, theaters ordered to close up and down the East Coast. Drastic rule in Chicago. that if you were not using a handkerchief when sneezing, you could be arrested. You could be arrested for public sneezing without a handkerchief. You know, you could take these headlines and you could just change the year, right? You don't even need to change the day. Just change the year to 2020 and it will be very similar. I couldn't resist this. It's hard to read it, so I wrote it down here. This was in the social pages of the New York Times. Owing to the illness of Miss Margaret Smith, the tea dance of her mother, Miss Frederick Depew Stewart, planned yesterday afternoon at the Gotham, has been indefinitely postponed. Miss Smith has pneumonia, and the attack was so sudden that 400 telegrams were sent to the invited guests. That's not a photo of the party because the party didn't happen. So you could be arrested in Chicago for public sneezing. You couldn't go to the theater. Churches were closed, and you couldn't even attend the dance. This is a statue of Hagar and Ishmael in the New Brunswick Library, which captures so much of the pathos, I think, of the influenza pandemic. It even affected the price of a coffin, which caused certain controversy, and the people who made coffins pushed back, and they said, look, we don't have enough people to make them. The price of the wood is going up. And so it affected every circle of life, every part of your life, right? Church, theater, social life, dances, walking up and down the street, and even the price of a coffin. So 1918, 1919 was a tough time for influenza. But there was a lot of other stuff happening in America during this time. The most important thing was that World War I ended. And so 4 million soldiers came home. And in fact, that was a big reason why the influenza pandemic spread among the young, among the military. It came over from Europe. It's interesting, when you look at pandemics, the speed of travel happens in relation to the transportation of the day. So the bubonic plague during the 14th century, it was essentially how far a person could walk in a day. And then the influenza pandemic was how fast a ship could cross the ocean. And of course, the COVID pandemic, time seemed to reverse, right? It was as fast as a plane around the world. That's how fast it spread. And then we realized it was already here. So this was a big deal. 4 million people came back from Europe after World War I. There was an economic boom, an industrial boom. 1 in 5 families bought a Model T, which opened up America to the West, to travel, to vacation. And of course, society opened up. There was this tension of moving from this agrarian society to a more urban society, and values changed. So, there's a photo of Louis Armstrong and, flappers and zoot suits. Things seemed to open up. It was the time when there were an equal number of people living in cities as were living in the country. That's when that shift happened. The industrialization caused a great migration north of people of color to work in the factories and higher paying jobs, and potentially some better living standards than the South. Average salaries doubled of course, not for everybody, but over that decade, you were making the average salary was about $3,600 in 1920, and it about doubled over the next 9 years. The price of a Model T Ford was about $360. It fluctuated over time. It actually went down. So a lot of change in the immediate years after the influenza pandemic. A lot of life happened. I'm really fascinated by this. The politics of our country in the early 1920s is very similar to the 2020s. So there was a very, very strong conservative movement. So Warren Harding, his slogan was "Return to Normalcy." That was his campaign slogan, people. It's hardly in my mind anyway, it's not quite the sort of gripping, slogan, "Return to normalcy." Well, what did he mean by that? A return to small town values, family-centered values, return to the sort of perhaps imagined simple ways of the country town. So return to normalcy, and that got him in the White House. After World War I, it was Calvin Coolidge or Woodrow Wilson. Oh, can't remember. After World War I, there was this big movement to establish the League of Nations, a cooperative global society, so that we would not have war anymore. But that failed. The United States wanted none of it. We're bringing our soldiers home from World War I, and we're shutting the door. So the League of Nations failed. There was a big Red Scare, the concern that communists were infiltrating society. And this, of course, was after the Russian Revolution in the earlier part of the 1900s. So the Red Scare, communists lurking about. There was a very strong racial injustice part of our history, that the KKK had a resurgence, and there were many public lynchings. And, all the Robert E. Lee statues from the Civil War, they weren't built after the Civil War. They were built in the 1920s. So there's very strong, pushback in certain parts of the world to stem some of these other social movements. And then there was equally so a very strong progressive political movement. So interestingly, the 18th Amendment, an amendment to the Constitution, people, outlawing the sale of alcohol, that happened in 1919. Interestingly, perhaps from our perspective, we might think, oh, that's a conservative, that's the teetotalers. That would be a conservative push. Actually, it was a part of the progressive movement to really stem the tide of the whiskey saloon bro culture, that there was a strong movement that the saloons, the whiskey culture was causing widespread alcoholism. It was destroying the family. It was contributing to public indecency. And a big part of that political organization was by women. And the momentum from the 18th Amendment was the 19th Amendment. So women's suffrage. So women earned the right to vote. Interestingly, the 18th Amendment, to make an amendment to the Constitution, you have to have, everyone in the federal government, but you have to have the state governments sign on, 2/3 of the state governments. 18th Amendment came in by a landslide. The 19th Amendment, not so much. It was a very close vote. I think it was Tennessee. Very close vote. Tipped the balance for women's suffrage. There was a lot of racial movements. There was a big protest around inequalities in Chicago. And of course, there was a riot in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where the black part of Tulsa was burned down. That was happened in 1921. So a lot of a strong call for racial justice and women's rights across the country. Labor unions really organized and became much, much stronger. Better working conditions in these factories, that better wages, better, shorter hours, child labor laws. All of that happened in the 1920s. Folks, does this sound familiar to you? Right? In the same way that we've had a very strong conservative movement in our country, very much so we have very strong progressive movement that in some ways our country is very divided these days. And that was felt very similar to the 1920s. Well, arts and culture really changed. The Harlem Renaissance, the Cotton Club, the Great Gatsby, that sort of life of the jazz age really captured our imagination. The photo of the cafe, of course, was not John Steinbeck, Hemingway. Hemingway in a Parisian cafe. So the lost generation, and the lost generation had a lot of meanings to it. It was the generation of artists who went to Paris essentially to find themselves, an early bohemian movement. But more than that, the lost generation looked at what life was like after World War I. How do we find ourselves? How do we find our way after this pandemic, after this terrible war to end all war? And so let's dance. Let's push the envelope of society and music. Let's have extravagant parties, capturing the sort of idea of the Gilded Age, which of course was the 19th century, but the Jazz Age, Great Gatsby, and all of that. And then what happened in religion? Well, the same challenges that were happening between the conservatives and the progressives played themselves out in the 1920s in the religious sphere, right? You guys might remember the Scopes trial from 1925. Essentially, it was a public school teacher, John Scopes, and he taught theories of evolution. And that was illegal at the time. And it was a very high profile case. William Bryant, he ran for president 3 times up against Clarence Darrow, who was a very, very famous lawyer representing the ACLU. And famously, Clarence Darrow put William Jennings Bryan on the stand. John Scopes lost, and he was fined $100, which was about $1,200 today. So you might say it was a slap on the wrist, but he lost. But of course, the momentum of modernity continued, and of course, evolution. While it's more widely accepted, this idea of modernists and traditionalists, there's still tension, right? This story is not over. And this was a political cartoon about the descent of the modernists. And as a physician trained in evidence-based medicine and as a faithful pastor, I'm fascinated by this ongoing conversation between religion and science. But it really reached a boiling point in our country back in the 1920s. And this story, it's still going on. All right. So that's the backdrop. What about the Reformed Church in America? Well, I had the happy pleasure of hanging out in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And if you guys have been to New Brunswick Seminary, there's this upper room. And in that room, there is a table, an elliptical shaped table that is famous. And that's me in the upper right-hand corner doing a selfie at this famous table, the American Revisers. So there were scholars who sat around that table and they revised the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and there are little name tags in brass around the table. And I got to sit at that table. And the good folks of New Brunswick, Patrick, Matt, all these good people, they hooked me up. And I poured over manuscripts from the Christian Intelligencer, the minutes of the General Synod, and other documents. I sat there, beautiful, wintry evening, reading through these old documents. It was great. It was such a beautiful, break from the normal rhythm of things. And so just a word about the Christian Intelligencer. This was the national hometown newspaper of the Reformed Church in America. On the left there was Theodore Roosevelt. He died in January 1919. And so, of course, the Christian Intelligencer had a very nice essay about him, about his contributions. So the beautiful thing about the Christian Intelligencer is it was a national magazine, but it had this hometown feel to it. So there were lots of essays about piety. You can see there'll be editorials about, not taking life too seriously. Again, I say rejoice. There will be the home corner, essays about the importance of fostering a rich home life, a children's portfolio, some essays and thoughts about the upcoming lectionary readings in church and sermon notes, prayers, poems, that kind of thing. And then notes about from classes meetings. And there was some charming, beautiful, passages. So here's on the left, Christian Endeavor Prayer Meeting by the Reverend Abram Dury. And you can see that first line there, kindliness is a heart quality, right? So you'd get this in your mailbox and you'd read about kindliness. And then there's the home corner, a poem about a good night. And then when the boys come home, when the boys come home from Europe and how they've changed, things like that. There were these charming advertisements in the back pages. So, hackneyed, gripping, an encyclopedia. You could order your encyclopedia. There were treatments for whooping cough and rheumatism, bronchitis. The Cincinnati Bell Company had an advertisement almost every week. You could, buy your church bell. And then, of course, I couldn't help but include, you could even buy a dainty negligee and boudoir accessories for Christmas gifts. It was all there in the Christian Intelligencer. So that was my primary source, along with Synod minutes and some other smaller essays and journals and things. But to put the RCA in context, about 134,000 members, 720 or so churches. And when you looked at the minutes between 1918 and 1919, 1919 and 1920, membership tended to be flat, actually. So official membership didn't really go down so much during the pandemic. And actually giving or income even went up a little bit. The soldiers came home, they started making a little more money, they could give a little more. So income went up, membership was about flat. In the minutes of synod, there was great consternation around the number of Sunday schools, that about 120,000 students were enrolled in the Sunday schools, and that number decreased somewhat by about 4,000 students, and the number of Sunday schools total decreased. Hard to say why. They didn't say why, but it may have been due to many things, right? Churches being closed, influenza pandemic, World War I, stymieing the growth of the Sunday schools. But in general, things were flat, maybe a dip in the kids, but membership was flat. This is the membership of First Reformed Church in Schenectady and Preakness Reformed Church. A shout out to Preakness that helped fund the Albert Smith Fellowship and one of the churches where the Reverend Smith served. So I wanted to focus on First Reformed Church and Preakness. And you could see there in 1918, Preakness had about 100 members, 101 members, and First Reformed about 335. And you can see, if you do the math, maybe a 10 to 20% drop in the years right around the pandemic. It's interesting, right? So the 4 million people come back from World War I. They come back from Europe. So there wasn't a World War I bump in membership, because in theory, most of them were already members or not. But then there was this dip, and you could see it remained flat. The membership remained flat in the early 1920s. And we're seeing some of that today in our in-person attendance. Things have not gone back, although our pandemic isn't quite over yet. So about a 10 to 20% drop when you get really granular into the story of these churches. The idea of masks, closing churches, opening churches, all of that happened as well. This was an editorial written by the editorial staff of the Christian Intelligencer. Tells the story of a minister. He went to his hometown church. The church was closed, and so he drove around to find a church that was open. Several churches were closed. He finally found a church that was open, and this is what he wrote. The question was forced upon the mind, is not the altar of God still the place of last resort? When is any person safer than just here? In times of national peril, the churches should be crowded. In times of threatening disease, the family pew should be as safe as the hearthstone itself. So the strong position, hey, we should go to church. We should fill the pews. What's the matter with us, right? Well, at the same time, in the back pages were these very small reports from classis, the classis meetings. This came from the Philadelphia classis. Owing to the influenza pandemic, only about half of the delegation was present, but the business was transacted and dispatched, and those present were most delightfully entertained and most bountifully fed by the good ladies of the church. So these notices over and over and over. Well, we hung in there. Attendance was down. We hung in there. We were fed by the ladies of the church, and we conducted our business with dispatch. This is a shout out to First Reformed Church of Scotia, New York, which is across the river from First Reformed Church of Schenectady. And I don't know if anybody from Schenectady classes is watching, but I was pouring through the announcements, and in 1918, First Scotia they burned their mortgage. They paid off their mortgage, and there it was. Of course, that building doesn't exist anymore, but that building was paid off in 1918. Shout out to First Reformed Church of Scotia. There's some more advertisements in the back. And right next to these advertisements, again in small font, this quarter has been one of unprecedented difficulties and disappointments. The Sibley Church was closed 7 and the Bigelow Church 6 Sundays on account of the epidemic. 4 deaths occurred. These were the first deaths in 6 years of the existence of the churches. And that was the East Sioux classes. Look at those advertisements. Why I believe the Bible, more church bells, your organ, nuxated iron. I had to look that up. Nuxated iron was essentially iron pills to help with your vitality, and it turned out they had other stuff in there, some magnesium, some lavender oil, and also some strychnine. So rat poison. Not enough rat poison to affect you in theory, but just so you know, stay away from the nuxated iron. Don't buy it. So I have a few concluding type slides, and I really invite, a conversation about this. Did the RCA forget about the influenza pandemic? There were not these big position papers. It was small font in the back pages, and it wasn't an RCA thing. It was a national forgetting. To this day, there is not a memorial to the influenza pandemic. And there's an article in the New York Times a couple months ago. In one cemetery, there's like a tiny bench or a small obelisk commemorating the influenza pandemic. This was a national forgetting, or maybe it was just life happened, right? So much was going on that the influenza pandemic was only one part of it, or maybe so many people died that we just couldn't cope, and it was a national denial. So pandemic plus war, social change, just life went on. In what ways is that a good thing? In what ways is that a bad thing, right? Did we cope with all of this? Or did we just put on our zoot suit and flapper outfits and just start dancing? I invite your thoughts on this. But what is true is that the influenza pandemic occupied a very small part of both our church consciousness and also our national consciousness. And have we been here before? In what ways have we been here before? Oh, just by the way, that's the shield of the RCA, and that's the window in the library at New Brunswick Seminary. So have we been here before? Well, in my conversations with the good folks at RCA, John Coakley and James Brum and I, we had coffee at the Panera down the street. And James reminded me of the line from Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. There's a lot that's very, very similar, right? The strong conservative elements in our country today, the strong liberal elements, progressive elements in our country today, racial strife, challenges, calls for racial justice, very much a part of our lives. In what ways are we forgetting the pandemic has even happened, even though we were all in quarantine just a few months ago? I think we are suffering this hidden pandemic from COVID-19. About half of us are struggling with depression, anxiety, bipolar, alcohol, drugs, substance abuse. It's affecting so much of us. The other piece is the loneliness. This is the hard part that we're not talking about as a country today, amongst ourselves today. And to what effect was that taking place in the 1920s? the loneliness, the mental health issues, the substance abuse. I think it was happening back then. We just didn't talk about it. And we just didn't talk about it. We're not talking about it today. I don't know about you guys, but at the good old Pilgrim Congregational Church, when we got back to worshiping in person, it was like a refreshing spring. It was a beautiful moment. At our church, we were very disciplined. We said, no coffee hour, just church, socially distanced, masks. When I did communion that first Sunday, I put on gloves, like a surgical procedure, It was such a balm of joy to come back together. It makes me believe that the church has an important role to play as we emerge from COVID-19 to address some of the loneliness and the anxiety and the depression. Of course, the church can't do it all, but I think we have a strong call to be radically hospitable to this world. So I think we've been here before. Maybe not exactly in the same way, but history rhymes. So I want to thank many, many people. This was a joy for me personally. I'm an RCA ordained pastor, and I've spent my life on the other side, my adult life on the other side of the Berkshire Mountains with the good Congregationalists and the good folks at Yale. And I'm really, really grateful and glad for all the support I've had at Yale University, who, supported my life in the ministry, even as a medical student, as a faculty member. And then, James is there and Patrick's there. Matt helped me. Catherine helped me. There's John Coakley there. And then on Thursday, a couple of weeks ago, President McCreary took me out to dinner. So that was a memorable, beautiful, joyful conversation and connection. And I just am so appreciative of the folks who created the Albert Smith Fellowship, for the Reverend Albert Smith, who influenced my life to this day. And then this beautiful, wonderful moment of being present to New Brunswick Seminary and just doing a deep dive and reconnecting. So I'm grateful, folks. I probably went over 20 minutes. Oh, goodness, I did. By a lot. All right. I'm going to stop. Questions, thoughts, visions, ideas. Dr. Janice, what do you think?
I'll give a brief response based on the what you've shared. So I've highlighted three things: similarities, silence, and you ended with this word or phrase, a strong call. So what could be the strong call to the RCA, but even the church more widely? I think for myself, going through the slides, listening to you today, and others who are here on this webinar, is recognizing the similarities. And yes, James is right. The history doesn't repeat itself, but what does it do, James?
It rhymes, and it was Mark Twain, not me.
Mark Twain, yes. So there's a lot of rhyming. There's rhyming in terms of needing to situate the pandemic moment, both the Spanish flu, but also our COVID-19 experience within the wider social, political, economic context, not just of the US, but globally as well. I think as I was listening to you, Ben, it's remembering the importance of movement. Pandemics don't just happen in isolation. They need the bodies of people to move from place to place. And so with the servicemen coming back from World War I, or even people traveling in our context, the virus will move. The virus moves from people to people, from context to context. And so it's recognizing in many ways that our responsibility is not just to ourselves, but it's to the wider human family. And so I think when we think about pandemics, not just in this moment, but even later on when we talk about strong call, what are some of the things that we could think about going forward, is that recognizing that we do not live for ourselves. We live as one unit within a wider family. And so our framework has to be expanded in many ways. It was interesting to see the political breakdown in terms of conservative, progressive, and the movements that were going on there, because it's similar movements are happening in our context with COVID-19 and certain reactions to so George Floyd's death in the midst of COVID heightened racial tensions, and not just the swing to the far right, but even the swing to the left as well. And so it's recognizing that all of these things in the midst of a pandemic, just like in the 1990s and then into the 20s, these kinds of things that are bubbling up, they're on the surface, start bubble up under really hard when people are going through very distressing times. In terms of silence, I think you're right. You focus your attention in the magazines, or you give your attention to what you consider to be most important. But I would caution us in our in the ways in which we may seek to be very hard on our brothers and sisters in the 1990s and 1918 and 1919 US in terms of what their priorities were or what they were focused on. Because when we situate the US silence and even the silence of RCA members, when you situate that within the wider context that at this time, the US is it's in the initial stages and on the verge of becoming the superpower. And so one of the things I note, so I'm in New York City, and while New York City is a historical city, if you go back to New Amsterdam and RCA Church being very much a part of that process for the city, New York City, unlike Boston or Philadelphia, does not have this. I would say the marked appreciation for history. So unlike Boston, where you have the kind of the historical trail, or Philadelphia with the Liberty Bell, where parts of the city are so given over to history, New York City, from its very origins, has this focus on commerce and advancement. And so that has shaped the city. And I think if we take that frame to what was going on within America at that time, this very forward-looking movement towards becoming this global power, superpower, it will help us to see how this lack of attention to marking this moment as it relates to that pandemic happened. And so I think one of the questions for us going forward, even in light of COVID-19, it's what are the things that we're going to put in place, not just to say, okay, we're getting back to normalcy, we're living into this new normal, but recognizing, as you rightly talk about in the last couple of slides, the ways in which we have been changed. Who we are today is very different from who we were in November 2019. And we can never go back, because to go back to that normalcy would be to disregard the lives of those who we've lost, the ones whose lives have been intimately associated with ours, and what it means to bear their loss or carry their loss with us. So in terms of the last point, the strong call, how do we move forward? And I was sharing with Ben and James this morning that part of the framing for me would be that passage of scripture in Matthew 25, where Jesus talks about what you have done to the least of these, you've done unto me. And so when it's how, what is our interaction or responsibility towards the least of these, however we're defining the least of these. So in the 1918 and 1919 pandemic, one of the things once I received Ben's PowerPoint was to think about what was the experience of Black and Brown people, or the least of these, during that context. And it's, from one of the studies that I looked at this morning, they were saying that while Black African Americans community didn't suffer as much infection rates as the white community, when they did get infected, they were more likely to die. And so as within that, you can hear this correlation even within when we think about COVID-19. In the midst of the stay-at-home orders, one of the things that struck me as an immigrant living in a city of immigrants is that for a lot of immigrants, life didn't stop. They were the essential workers. They were the grocery store cashiers, or the nurses or health aides in the hospitals, or the ones who were going to Costco or other supermarkets to fill people's Instacart orders. And so it's recognizing that how we interact with the least of these bears an impact on us in our future, and them in their immediate context as well. And so it's highlighting that the way forward, it's not just a looking back, but it's what are the measures we will take going forward? What are the things that we will put in place that if Black and Brown peoples were disproportionately impacted by COVID because of underlying issues, the ways in which the environments they live in have been disproportionately impacted by different structures and policies that have been in place, be it in the cities or the towns or the suburbs where they are. It's recognizing that the work to correct this cannot just be religious. We have to take a very multidisciplinary health approach. So even Ben, I think Ben, this is one area where your other hat, where your physician hat comes into play in speaking to what are the health issues that Black and Brown people disproportionately are impacted by, because those underlying issues then make you more susceptible to the pandemic, be it this one or even the future ones to come. The last thing I would say in terms of this strong call, as it relates to a possible way forward, is recognizing that we're one part of a global church. And so it's thinking through how do we relate to others, be it the immigrants in our communities, but the brothers and sisters who are in Christian churches across the world, in terms of the ways in which they too, in particular ways, might be the least of these. And so it's considering what it means to be a part of this global family in terms of what are the political decisions we make as a country, what are the economic decisions we make, thinking through, I guess for some, even for myself, this is where the rubber meets the road. Because as COVID continues to spread in places where they don't even have the first vaccine, for us who are fortunate to have vaccines, yes, we have some immunity, but the mutations will still happen. And so as we lean into the future with the similarities between the both pandemics, the silence that's there, it's also recognizing that we are one community in the midst of other communities, and their livelihoods or their well-being will impact our well-being. And so our focus and our vision needs to be more expansive than it is if we want for everybody to thrive and to flourish. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you, Ben. Now it's up to the rest of us to continue this conversation. So I invite folks to go ahead and hit their little raise hand button, and I can call on you and help you unmute, and we can have some discussion here. I see a little bit of it going on in chat, but here we go. So Alden Doolittle, otherwise known as Joe, otherwise known by Ben as Dad.
Well, yeah, Doolittles are famous for kind of kicking off the conversation, and it struck me, Ben, particularly with the Mark Twain quote, that the response in both situations is one of everybody being overwhelmed. And I'm not sure that as a society we experience that frequently. And it would seem to me that the church would have a role in that in terms of how we get people to think about getting some traction, whether it's spiritual or physical. But I know that's kind of the perspective that I see myself. So that was my question on the chat. You did a pretty good job, kid.
Thanks, Dad. Yeah, I'm really, I share with my residents the first rule of medicine, which is this. The first rule of medicine is that the medicine is easy and everything else is hard. And by that, I mean, how do you treat COVID? Well, you look it up, and from month to month, it changes, right? Tocilizumab and steroids, or, remdesivir or not, and all, it changes, but the medicine is easy. The fund of knowledge stuff is pretty straightforward. If you don't know what to do, you get a CAT scan. If you don't know what to do, draw some blood. If you don't know what to do, ask a consult, right? The medicine side of life, the medicine side of medicine is easy. Everything else is hard. And that includes, someone with HIV taking the medication every day when maybe insurance is unsettled, maybe people have suspicion about the medicine. How do you get to the appointments? On and on and on and on. How do you get an elderly person home, to a safe home when that person's been in the hospital for a month with COVID? How do you take care of an entire neighborhood that has been ravaged by COVID? The medicine, when that person's standing in front of you, sitting in front of you, the medicine side of medicine tends to be pretty straightforward, but it gets very complex as soon as you go outside of the realm of medicine. And I think, I'm concerned about the church. I think the church, certain voices of the church seem to be louder than other voices. And some of those loud voices are kind of mean, I think. And I think the side of the church that is hospitable and welcoming to those on the margins, I think we got to be a little more louder, a little more loud. Like, I think we need to be, it's easy to say we're a nice church when that person walks into your church. But how about reaching out to those folks who might not feel so welcomed because the church is this big structure, and maybe, you hand them a bulletin and that person might not read or might not have English as a first language. I don't know, I think we, the church is in this very powerful challenge. I think, I'll reveal my colors, right? The liberal progressive side of the church. I think we're too nice. And I think we need to be a little more thoughtful and intentional in our outreach and hospitality.
The one thing
That's what I think.
The one thing I would add, so at New Brunswick, I teach classes. Well, some of the classes I teach are on urban ministry. And I say to my students that if you approach the urban context with just theology, you aren't equipped to do effective urban ministry. And before you want to crucify me about the theology, let me say the rest. The urban context, like the suburban context and the rural context, are very complex. It's almost like a system. Think of your body as a system where all of these pieces impact each other. And so when we approach these communities with just theology, we're coming at a system with just one thing. We need to be more cross-disciplinary and multidisciplinary when we're seeking to approach communities. And that means that we are partnering, we need to know history. We need to be at least become conversant with policies, the ways in which the economic landscape has shifted and continues to shift. What's the DNA? One of the things I ask students to pay attention to is what's the DNA of your community? New York City has a particular DNA. Schenectady has a particular DNA. Do you even go to in New York City, it's the community boards, the local boards that decide on what happens in those communities, because the church is one organization within other social organizations within an area. And so it's recognizing that all of these things are going to be shaping not just the church life, but the lives of those in that community. So when you're thinking about outreach, we have to take a wider picture when we're coming alongside people. And so it's recognizing that these are the strengths I bring to the table. I don't bring everything. So what are the partnerships we need to have with organizations, non-for-profits within those communities to then be able to do this more extensive work that can touch the lives of people in all of these areas, because everything comes together when we're seeking to bring about transformation and change in people's lives.
Thank you both. Valentina Jones, would you go ahead and unmute? You can talk.
Hi, my name is Valentina Jones, and I'm from DeWitt Reformed Church here in Manhattan. I guess what I think about is the role of the church. And I think that a holistic approach is what we need. One of the things when you talk about outreach, you have to now think about the impact of the pandemic on outreach. That has a big impact these days, or rather, and when you talk about even say the community board, that is now on Zoom, and they have to think about how they're going to somewhat come out of Zoom. That has been like put on the back burner a couple of times because of the surge. Right now, today, you have airplanes that say you don't need to wear a mask, and then you have things surging, and then you have on TV, everyone is talking about how do you talk about take off the mask and it's surging? How do you put these things together? One of the things that I noted, I started a book club with I think it's Highbridge Community Church. And what we wanted to do, or rather what I really wanted to do, was hear the Christian perspective on the pandemic and on racial issues, because I knew that they would be big issues coming up. And one of the things that really got me, a couple of things got me. One was the scripture that does it for me with this pandemic is love thy neighbor as thyself. And everybody, if you didn't get it before, everyone is your neighbor. With this pandemic, everyone is your neighbor. So if you, whatever issues you had with gay people, Black people, white people, Hispanic people, whatever people, they are your neighbor now. If you didn't get it before, you should have got it now. And one of the things is, in terms of looking for a book on the pandemic, one of the things that got me was one of the books that I really liked. The person was talking about the fact that a lot of people are saying, well, where is God in all of this? And what this person was saying was that they looked at the Beatitudes, and that that's where God is in us, and in us being characters of the Beatitudes. And what really got me was that otherwise, in terms of this book I had wanted to use, I then looked at the health part of it. And the health part was a little scary, because I don't think the person at that point, I think the health department, they were still not talking about masks, because this was early on. So the thing becomes, finding a book that actually uses the health material, the science of it, not the economics of let's keep, things open, but the science of it. And so I actually, if you know of a book that talks about this and has the science correct, would appreciate. And just talking about doing outreach in the midst of, I heard you say outreach, doing outreach in the midst of the pandemic, just to comment on those particular things. And I think that as you talk about New York, one of the things that I thought about was when Ebola was out. And I was like, somebody got on a plane and came to New York, and they probably realized how good a medical emergency service Bellevue is. And I'm like, something else is coming, and somebody's getting on a plane, and they're going to come to New York so they can be near Bellevue, because that is like free emergency services. So these are kind of the things that I think about and would like to hear your response on.
So in terms of the travel piece, so the health piece, I don't know of a book yet. Maybe Ben, this is a call to yourself and others in the medical field that can bridge the divide between theology and science, to put those together in one book. In terms of the travel piece, it's recognizing that it's not just New York. So if you look in the UK, areas where you had high percentages of people from India, they were seeing spikes as well. And so it's people travel, viruses and, microbes travel as well. And so it's recognizing the significance of movement for people, and the way that is going to shape how things ebb and flow as it relates to pandemics and diseases. And then factoring that into outreach. You're right about the neighbor piece. We have to consider everyone as our neighbors, because their lives impact ours in very real ways.
So thank you for your comments. They were terrific. And I love the idea of a book club, because that's like, you're building connection and community, even though we're all sitting in our big green chair at home. That sounds really cool. I just like everything you said. I'll tell you, the one book, I haven't read it, so that's the little caveat, but I am interested in, and also in preparation for this talk, I did a deep dive in the influenza pandemic. So I have like a stack of history books here. But the book I'm interested in is this book called, and I'll throw it in the chat. So there's this guy, Nicholas Christakis, he's a physician and a sociologist, and he wrote this book called Apollo's Arrow. And if I were to read a book about the COVID pandemic, the next one, I would read this one because I'm curious about it. And here's why. Nicholas Christakis, he's the guy who figured out if your friend loses weight, if your friend's friend loses weight, your friend loses weight, and then you lose weight. Or if your friend's friend is depressed, your friend gets depressed, then you get depressed. So he's a big like social connection guy, and takes a macro view of medicine. And so I'm curious about his thoughts on this book because about the COVID pandemic, because I think it's a lot about how our social connections got really stretched and torn because of the pandemic. I don't know. Haven't read the book, but that would be my next go-to about the COVID pandemic. In the interest of time, I welcome other conversation or another question. Even that person's thinking, oh, I don't want to talk on this big panel group or whatever, but I invite that person, whoever you are, to ask your question because probably someone else is thinking of your question. Otherwise, the three of us are just going to start going on. Does anybody else have another question?
You're not, Ben. We've got somebody else here with a question. Mary Rousseau.
Hey, Mary Rousseau, you might be still be on mute.
I'm off now. Ben, I have not seen you since you were a middle school student. When I was a member of First Schenectady, when my brother David served with Dean Dykstra. It's been a long time.
Yeah. We ran the youth group when I was a kid in the youth group. Mary, this is what a joy. Oh my goodness.
I just said hello to your dad.
I'm exactly the same, except maybe a little bit shinier on top, but I'm basically exactly the same.
Yes, so am I. And while I've greatly enjoyed the rest of this conversation, because I think it's incredibly important, I'm also going to go back to a historical perspective because in 2019, I wrote a magazine article about how the flu epidemic affected Hollanders more in the Midwest than any place else, because my research is Dutch American immigration history. But what I found that maybe I found interesting what you were saying about what you found in the Christian Intelligencer or didn't find in those records is in some local history things, but in the newspapers of the time, I found incredible details about what RCA and CRC ministers were doing. And what was actually happening in those communities as they were trying to deal with the deaths of all their boys overseas, as well as what was happening in their congregations and how they dealt with having to close their churches. And there were a couple of Dutch-born physicians who had immigrated and served on the East Coast and throughout the Midwest. And I found accounts of them, what they were actually dealing with as physicians in having to travel to, rural communities to deal with the effects of the epidemic that were fascinating to me to find personal stories within our church communities and within these church denominations, how people were handling it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's really neat. Yeah, I wonder if, you raise a really great point that maybe the experience of the pandemic was local, and the experience of these things are always local. So that's a very wise thought. I was struck by how loud the silence was in the in the national magazines. Like you go to the Christian Intelligencer, and the main essays are about piety and all this and getting ready for the Sunday sermon, and then the notes in the back in small print talked about some of the loss. But then you go to the New York Times the same month, and it's the influenza pandemic is all over. And maybe that was a coping strategy, maybe, right? Like we're trying to preserve some semblance of normalcy while people are dying, while people are, home. They can't come to church. I don't know. That's a wise thought. I'll have to think more about that. The experience of the pandemic locally.
It makes me wonder how much more there is buried in there about what was shared publicly in newspapers and what was shared privately or not shared.
Yeah, great point.
There really is far more evidence publicly than people are aware of. I was astounded by the amount of source material in newspapers.
Yeah, fascinating. That's really interesting. Reverend Brum, it's 12:29, and I'm sensitive that 12:30 is I'm going to throw my email in the chat in case folks want to reach out. But that's how to reach me. And I invite further conversation, and I'm just delighted to be a part of this.
We've had two other people in the queue, and I was going to, if we can stick around.
Oh, yeah. You know what? I'm around. I'm just here. Actually, can I let my dog out? Hold on a sec. I'm going to let
we will hang on just a minute. And so Douglas raised his hand.
Look at that. All right, Nathan, go ahead.
I'm going to invite Nathan to go ahead and unmute. Well, you're up anyway, Nathan, so you get to speak.
All right. Yeah, so thank you, Ben, for the presentation. My question, and I had typed in the Q&A too, is it seems one thing that's less pronounced, in that silence is that we don't have bold arguments from pastors in the 1918 influenza advocating about government overreach or for religious freedom and, public health as an affront to religious freedom. So those arguments are rather weak compared to what they have been in our present pandemic, where that, especially in white evangelical Christianity, has been such a dominant function of sort of where media has liked to look at Christian activities tied to anti-governmental ideology, and so I think that highlights. So the question is if you find that is consistent with your read of these sources, and to me that seems to highlight the way that fundamentalism and its sort of attendant anti-governmental ideologies have grown in the last 100 years, and I think if that holds with your readings, perhaps we could take stock of where. And how that process has happened, whereby religious and political arguments are eroding significantly a context for a sort of common approach to the government or to the public good in American churches.
I can tell I'm speaking to an esteemed faculty member, because that was rich. I'm not sure what forgive me. I'm not sure what the could you just repeat the question part? Or you could just take over. That was like pretty cool stuff. I got to think about that.
Yeah, no, I really, it's just, does that hold up? Is that one of the things that's silent, that we don't have not only are our churches not talking about it, but as a result, they're not making arguments that that the government involvement, which certainly was there, or that shutdowns of churches, which were certainly there in 1918, we don't have religious leaders or voices or feature stories in the Christian Intelligencer claiming, government overreach, right? So that the silences include the things that they're not arguing, which we have experienced in such dominant forms in the present pandemic. And I'm asking, since you've done the deep read of those sources, if you think that holds true.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating point. And so as I understand the question, it's like, wait, why wasn't the RCA screaming about the need to close the churches? You're right. There wasn't anything in those moments. It was just the reporting in the classis minutes. Oh, church was closed for 8 weeks. So that's fascinating, right? Like they didn't push back against some of those things. And it makes me wonder if some of that stuff was just so local, So was there not a national response because churches were open here, but not here, and closed over there? And in December, they were closed in New York, but then in March, they were closed in Michigan. I don't know. So it might have been so fractured, I guess. I'm struck by how quickly the science gets politicized. And I think, the Scopes trial about the teaching of evolution in 1925, Darwin published his Evolution of the Species I think it was the 1830s. So for almost 100 years, it was part of the standard curriculum in universities. But yet 100 years later, it was so politicized. And we see how science is still politicized by religion, right? So, that ostinato continues to this day. And it's where I think, a thoughtful voice matters from the church to say, vaccines saved a lot of lives, and that they're safe. 500 million vaccines have been given, more than that. And the side effects are minimal relative to the lives that they saved. If you get a vaccine, you're, 5 times less likely to be hospitalized and 10 times less likely to die. That's powerful stuff, right? And so I think, people listen to their pastors some of the time. I think an important voice that's not the conservative voice from the church could be really helpful. And we haven't really done that. Anyway, I don't know. Dr. McLean Farrell, what any thoughts on that?
I'm just listening.
Yeah.
You'll need, I think of, when I think of certain communities, the presence of historical abuse around medicine has been part of the resistance to certain vaccines, say even in the African American communities. And so it's recognizing, I think it's recognizing that this moment sits in a wider history. And I think that has to be the starting point for framing the conversation around vaccines being useful. So, in many ways, you have to start where people are, acknowledging the resistance, if resistance is there, even if the resistance is politicized, getting to the root of why is it politicized? What's the subterranean thing or root that's holding that? And then starting from there to have the conversations with people, to getting them to where they need to be in terms of embracing the medicine and the potential it has to save their lives and the lives of their loved ones. I think one of the things that have struck me throughout the COVID pandemic, is reading those very heart-wrenching reports of relatives who have died, and then their funerals becoming vaccination events. And people are saying, if we had known, we would have done differently. Or even, in my family, some of my relatives are in the medical field, including nurses, and hearing from them what it is like treating COVID patients and the toll it takes on staff has been heart-wrenching to hear. Yeah.
Indeed. Reverend Brum, I thought there was a second question. Or
Well,
Nathan, did we respond appropriately?
There is one more question coming, and I thought you all responded wonderfully. I would also add a little bit of context about the RCA not responding. And that is that historically, as a denomination, the RCA has been very, very slow to respond to national social issues and very, very resistant, even though there have always been voices in the RCA that push to answer earlier. For example, the General Synod of the RCA did not take a position on slavery until 1864, when they were pretty sure how the war was going to turn out. They were similarly reluctant to take a position on Vietnam, despite being pushed by all sorts of forces, including seminarians who turned their draft cards into the General Synod. There is a resistance. But now let's get to our last question. Thank you all. Douglas Moore, would you go ahead?
Yes, thank you for this presentation. It's been wonderful, Doctor. I appreciate it. I pastor in Cape May County, New Jersey, and that's quite a distance politically from where I was born and raised and ministered initially. And down here, I deal with a lot of vaccination hesitancy, and it's interesting because politically speaking, the African American community is largely progressive or democratic, and the white community is largely conservative, dare I say Trumpian. But one thing they both have in common is not messing with the vaccine, not wanting to get vaccinated. And you've also caused me to think about my preaching over the pandemic, and especially since I've come down here 8 months ago, and how many of my sermons have been informed and shaped by COVID. And you've just kind of put me on notice to allow the Spirit to work through me to continue to use the pulpit, to press the importance of getting vaccinated and churches and people working together. And I was just curious in your process in looking at this, what was the preaching response during this influenza pandemic of 1918, 1919, and also how preachers have been shaped and informed by the pandemic in your contemporary research? Thank you.
Reverend Moore, that was a great question. And I thought that I had the same question myself. And so I looked and I couldn't find anything. And it's not because I don't think it's there. I just didn't find anything. I bet you Mary Rousseau said, oh yeah, here was this book. It's filled with sermons. I just didn't find any. I was really curious about that because, was it sort of the wrath of God, we deserve this kind of narrative, or was it, God is a suffering God and God will deliver us. I mean, was that going to be the message? I just don't know. I was very curious. What's so fun at New Brunswick Seminary is you go down in the basement. There are all sorts of treasures in the basement, fragments of ancient papyri and stuff. Super awesome, great stuff. But I did not find any book compendium of sermons from that time. They may have been there. Hey, maybe I need to hang out in the basement of the New Brunswick Library some more. That was super fun for me. But Reverend Moore, you raise a really interesting point about how two different communities that don't agree on anything can come to the same conclusion, but from completely different ways, right? So the conservative folks who maybe ally themselves with Trump would say, why is the government telling me to get this thing, right? And then the African-American community might come at it from, hey, what about Tuskegee? What about Henrietta Lacks? I just don't trust this. So it's kind of different positions and then coming to the same thing, which is don't stick that needle in my arm. A big part of my practice is people with HIV, more than 20 years taking care of people with HIV. And, the medicine these days, you can take one pill once a day and the side effects are minimal. That wasn't the true 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. The side effects, they are minimal. And it can make your virus undetectable and you can live, we don't know how long. You can live as long as everybody else. Some increased risk of cardiovascular disease, maybe some lymphomas. But basically, if you take one pill once a day, you're going to live. And so my patients, they've told me over the years, two different stories. One, this medicine is power. This medicine is life. This medicine is a gift from God. This medicine helps me live. And I'm grateful for it. I'm glad for it. Some days I get side effects. I don't know if it's from the medicine or not, but I'm going to keep taking it because I live. The other narrative is this is a pill that reminds me of shame, of guilt, of, an impulsive decision that maybe I made that I shouldn't have made. It reminds me of how I'm different from other people, how I don't belong. And when people tell that story to themselves, they don't want to take their medicine. So again, it comes back to the medicine is easy and everything else is hard, right? Anybody can write a prescription for Biktarvy, one pill once a day. But to have it embedded in someone's consciousness that this medicine can save their lives, that's hard, right? That takes time. And sometimes we don't have the time, but it's important that we find the time. And I think this vaccine is the same thing, right? There's can be all kinds of suspicion, but if the narrative is, this could save my life. This could make it so that I could see my grandchildren, that they don't have to drive by and wave out the window. I don't know if you guys remember that. So I think the narrative matters, right? Because we respond to stories more than we respond to a graph. Anyway, that's just my thoughts, Reverend Moore, and I'm appreciate the comment. Reverend Brum, any other questions have come up on the?
No, I don't think so. I thank you everybody for a really nice, robust discussion. Ben, it was a pleasure having you at New Brunswick, and we will be happy to welcome you again when you've got some time and want to come down and visit. And it was a pleasure being here with all of you today. I hope I see some of you at future Reformed Church Center gatherings, and that you're all taking good care of yourselves, because we know that the COVID hasn't gone away. And just stay careful and stay well. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye, everyone.